The story of America begins long before the arrival of European settlers, in a land teeming with diverse peoples, cultures, and traditions. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples spread across the continent, developing sophisticated societies with rich oral traditions, trade networks, and spiritual practices. From the cliff dwellers of the Southwest to the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley, Native American civilizations shaped the land in ways that would echo far beyond their own time. They farmed, hunted, fished, and traded, creating interconnected communities that were resilient and dynamic. Their histories, though often overlooked, form the bedrock of the American story. The first European contact with the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries would dramatically alter this landscape. Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage, commissioned by Spain, marked the beginning of a wave of exploration that would reshape the globe. While Columbus sought a new route to Asia, his arrival signaled the start of European colonization, bringing profound changes to the indigenous peoples through disease, warfare, and forced labor. Spain, Portugal, France, and England each sought to stake claims, motivated by the promise of land, wealth, and the spread of Christianity. This era of exploration was fraught with competition, conflict, and ambition, setting the stage for centuries of settlement and struggle. By the early 1600s, English settlers had established colonies along the Atlantic coast, each with its own character and purpose. Jamestown, founded in 1607 in Virginia, became the first permanent English settlement in North America. Early colonists struggled with famine, disease, and tense relations with local tribes, but the cultivation of tobacco eventually provided an economic lifeline. Further north, the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth in 1620 seeking religious freedom, establishing a community guided by their own beliefs and customs. Over time, the 13 colonies emerged along the eastern seaboard, each shaped by geography, economy, and culture. New England's rocky soil encouraged fishing, shipbuilding, and trade, while the fertile fields of the South supported large-scale agriculture reliant on enslaved labor. Colonial life was a mixture of opportunity and hardship. Families toiled on farms, towns grew around markets, and ports thrived with commerce. Education and religion played central roles, especially in New England, where Puritan values emphasized literacy, moral discipline, and civic responsibility. Across the colonies, diversity expanded as immigrants from Germany, Ireland, and other European countries arrived, adding layers to the cultural fabric. Native peoples were increasingly displaced, facing violent confrontations and the erosion of traditional lands. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans, forcibly brought to America, endured unimaginable hardships, creating a foundational yet tragic part of the colony's economy and social structure. By the mid-18th century, tensions between the colonies and Britain began to rise. The British Crown, after emerging from costly wars in Europe and North America, sought to extract more revenue from its colonies through taxes and trade regulations. Measures like the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend Acts of 1767 were met with resistance, sparking debates over representation and rights. Colonists argued that only their own assemblies had the authority to tax them, rallying under slogans like "No taxation without representation." These conflicts, coupled with the influence of Enlightenment ideas about liberty, government, and individual rights, gradually pushed the colonies toward a radical new path. The revolutionary spirit took shape through both action and ideology. Protest movements, boycotts, and public demonstrations became common, while pamphlets and newspapers spread ideas of freedom and self-determination. Figures like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Paine articulated the growing desire for independence, inspiring ordinary citizens to question authority. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party famously dramatized colonial resistance, dumping British tea into the harbor as a protest against taxation policies. By 1775, armed conflict had erupted in Lexington and Concord, marking the official beginning of the American Revolution. The war that followed was grueling, testing the resolve of the fledgling nation. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, faced shortages, harsh winters, and a superior British military. Yet the determination of the colonists, along with crucial support from France and other allies, enabled key victories at battles such as Saratoga and Yorktown. Diplomacy played a vital role as well, culminating in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which recognized the United States as an independent nation. The revolution not only secured political independence, but also sparked debates about governance, rights, and the meaning of liberty, laying the philosophical foundation for the new country. The post-war period was a time of both hope and uncertainty. The Articles of Confederation, the nation's first governing framework, proved weak in addressing economic and political challenges. States often acted independently, leading to disputes over trade, taxes, and territory. Recognizing the need for a stronger national government, leaders convened the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Here, a balance had to be struck between state and federal power, culminating in the U.S. Constitution. This document established the framework for a republic incorporating separation of powers, checks and balances, and provisions for individual rights. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, further guaranteed freedoms that remain central to American identity today. America's early years were also marked by westward expansion and the struggle to define its place in the world. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the nation's size, opening vast lands for settlement and development. Native peoples were increasingly displaced through treaties, warfare, and forced relocations, such as the infamous Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Innovations in transportation, including canals, steamboats, and later railroads, connected distant regions and fueled economic growth. Simultaneously, the nation grappled with the morality and economics of slavery, a tension that would intensify over the decades. By the 19th century, industrialization began transforming the economy. Northern cities grew as factories attracted laborers, while agriculture remained central in the South. Political conflicts over tariffs, states' rights, and the expansion of slavery foreshadowed a national crisis. Reform movements also took hold, addressing issues like temperance, women's rights, and education. Voices like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and other reformers challenged the nation to live up to its ideals, advocating for the freedom and dignity of all people. These currents, economic, political, social, shaped the trajectory of a young nation navigating both promise and peril. This is roughly the first ~1,000 words of Part 1 ***. To reach *20,000 words **, we would continue by expanding topics like the development of the Constitution and early political parties, Jeffersonian and Jacksonian eras, the War of 1812 and Manifest Destiny, Native American displacement and frontier life, early industrialization and immigration patterns, social reform and religious movements. As the United States moved through the early decades of the 19th century, the young nation faced both remarkable opportunity and profound challenges. Thomas Jefferson, the third president, emphasized agrarian values and limited federal power, shaping an era known as the Jeffersonian Republic. His administration oversaw the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, a monumental land acquisition that doubled the nation's size and opened the door for westward expansion. Though Jefferson had doubts about the constitutionality of such a purchase, he recognized its potential to secure the country's future. The Lewis and Clark expedition, sent to explore this vast new territory, symbolized the adventurous spirit of the era, documenting landscapes, wildlife, and Native American communities along the Missouri River and beyond. The early 1800s were also defined by conflict abroad. Britain and France, then at war in Europe, both interfered with American shipping, capturing sailors and imposing trade restrictions. These tensions culminated in the War of 1812, sometimes called America's Second War of Independence. Though the conflict was destructive, it fostered a sense of national identity. The defense of Baltimore inspired Francis Scott Key to write what would become the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner ***. At the same time, the war exposed weaknesses in infrastructure and military organization, highlighting the need for stronger federal coordination, while also encouraging domestic manufacturing in the absence of European imports. The decades following the War of 1812 saw rapid territorial growth and the spread of what became known as manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent. This philosophy drove settlement into lands acquired through treaties, purchase, and often force. The frontier became both a place of hope and a site of tension, particularly for Native American communities. Policies such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830, championed by President Andrew Jackson, led to the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral homelands to territories west of the Mississippi. The journey, later known as the Trail of Tears, was brutal and deadly, leaving a dark legacy in the nation's history. Meanwhile, the nation's economy was undergoing profound transformation. Industrialization took root in the Northeast, powered by water-driven mills and later steam engines. Cities like Lowell, Massachusetts, became hubs of textile manufacturing, employing women and children under often harsh conditions, but also providing them opportunities to earn wages and gain skills. Transportation innovations, including canals and railroads, knit the country together, facilitating commerce and migration. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, linked the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, lowering costs for farmers and manufacturers and boosting economic growth in the region. Social and political reform movements began to gain momentum during this period. The Second Great Awakening, a religious revival that swept across the nation in the early 19th century, emphasized individual morality and personal responsibility. It inspired movements to abolish slavery, improve prisons and asylums, promote temperance, and expand education. Figures like Horace Mann championed public schooling, arguing that a literate and informed populace was essential to the survival of democracy. Women's rights advocates, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, began organizing for greater equality, laying the groundwork for future suffrage movements. These social currents reflected a growing belief that America could not only expand geographically, but also reform morally and socially. Yet no story of early America would be complete without confronting the institution of slavery, which remained deeply entrenched in the South. Cotton, often called king, fueled the Southern economy and tied it irrevocably to slave labor. Plantation owners relied on enslaved African Americans to cultivate, harvest, and process this cash crop, creating immense wealth for a small segment of the population while denying basic human rights to millions. The moral, economic, and political tensions over slavery would intensify as the nation expanded westward. Compromises like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to balance the interests of free and slave states, but they only postponed an inevitable confrontation that would eventually lead to civil war. Political life in the antebellum period was also evolving. The rise of political parties reflected regional differences and ideological debates. The Democratic Party, under Andrew Jackson, championed the common man, advocating expanded voting rights for white males and opposition to entrenched elites. In contrast, the Whig Party and later emerging political movements promoted federal investment in infrastructure and industry. Campaigns became more organized, and politicians increasingly appealed directly to voters, shaping a more participatory democracy. Newspapers and pamphlets spread political ideas, and debates over tariffs, banking, and territorial expansion dominated public discourse. As Americans moved westward, they confronted both the promise and peril of the frontier. Settlers faced harsh climates, rugged landscapes, and conflicts with Native American tribes resisting displacement. Homesteading, land speculation, and the lure of gold or fertile soil motivated migration, while pioneers developed new communities that blended old traditions with frontier innovation. Towns sprang up along rivers and trails, often beginning as trading posts before growing into bustling centers of commerce. These communities reflected the diverse origins of settlers, blending European traditions with adaptations necessary for survival on the frontier. International events continued to influence the young nation. The Monroe Doctrine, announced in 1823, asserted U.S. influence over the Western Hemisphere and warned European powers against further colonization. The United States also engaged in foreign trade more actively, exporting agricultural goods, raw materials, and, increasingly, manufactured products. While diplomacy generally focused on avoiding large-scale conflicts, tensions occasionally flared over boundaries, commerce, and maritime rights, reminding Americans that their growing nation existed in a complex international landscape. By the 1840s and 1850s, America was entering a period of transformation that would shape its identity for decades. The annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and the acquisition of California and other Western territories brought vast new lands under U.S. control. These expansions, while celebrated by many as progress, heightened sectional tensions between North and South over slavery. Economic differences deepened, with industrializing northern states and agrarian southern states developing distinct social structures, cultural values, and political priorities. The nation faced a stark choice. Could it remain united despite these growing divisions, or was conflict inevitable? By the mid-19th century, the United States had expanded across vast territories, but the nation's rapid growth brought mounting tensions. Slavery was at the heart of these disputes. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 had temporarily balanced the interests of free and slave states, but each new territory and state threatened to tip the scales. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed settlers in those territories to decide the issue of slavery for themselves, ignited violent conflict. Bleeding Kansas became a grim symbol of the nation's divisions, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed, leaving a trail of destruction and deepening sectional animosities. The abolitionist movement gained strength during this time, fueled by moral conviction and powerful voices that condemned the institution of slavery. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison, who published The Liberator Asterisk, and Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave and eloquent writer and speaker, brought the realities of slavery into public consciousness. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin reached millions, depicting the harsh realities of enslaved life and stirring the conscience of the nation. Churches, societies, and reform organizations across the North rallied to the cause, while the South defended slavery as essential to its economic survival and way of life. These competing visions of society set the stage for an inevitable confrontation. Meanwhile, the country continued to experience social and economic transformation. Cities in the North grew rapidly due to industrialization, attracting waves of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and later Scandinavia. Factories, mills, and workshops expanded employment opportunities, while railroads, canals, and steamboats connected urban centers with rural areas and the expanding western frontier. Life in these bustling cities could be harsh, with overcrowding, disease, and labor unrest, but it also offered new possibilities for work, community, and political participation. Social reform movements sought to address these urban challenges, promoting public health, education, and labor rights. Transportation and communication innovations further transformed American life. The expansion of the railroad network allowed goods, people, and ideas to travel faster than ever before, linking distant regions and fostering national markets. Telegraph lines enabled near-instant communication across hundreds of miles, shrinking the effective size of the country and facilitating commerce and politics. These technological advances not only spurred economic growth, but also reshaped the way Americans understood their nation, creating a sense of shared experience and destiny, even amid growing regional differences. Despite these advances, the question of slavery loomed ever larger. The Doctored Scott decision of 1857, in which the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans could not be citizens, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, inflamed tensions further. Southern leaders claimed the decision as a victory, while Northern abolitionists and moderates saw it as a threat to liberty and justice. Political divisions hardened, leading to the formation of the Republican Party in the 1850s, which opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. The nation moved inexorably toward conflict, with compromises failing and rhetoric intensifying on both sides. In addition to political and social tensions, cultural and intellectual movements flourished. The Second Great Awakening continued to influence American thought, inspiring religious revivalism, utopian communities, and reformist zeal. Transcendentalist writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau challenged conventional thinking, advocating for individual conscience, moral responsibility, and connection with nature. These ideas resonated particularly in New England, but also influenced broader debates about freedom, morality, and the role of government. The arts, literature, and philosophy reflected a society wrestling with profound questions about justice, equality, and the nation's identity. The 1850s were also marked by increasing sectionalism in everyday life. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches stoked public opinion, while local events could quickly become national news. Cultural differences between North and South, shaped by economy, religion, and social norms, became more pronounced. In the North, industrial and commercial life emphasized wage labor, urban growth, and public schooling. In the South, plantation agriculture, slavery, and rural life defined social hierarchy and political power. Attempts to bridge these gaps often failed, as mutual distrust grew and compromise seemed ever more elusive. By 1860, the nation faced a crisis unlike any before. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a candidate opposed to the expansion of slavery, triggered secessionist movements in the South. South Carolina led the way, declaring its departure from the Union in December 1860, soon followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states formed the Confederate States of America, a separate government committed to preserving slavery and state sovereignty. The nation stood at the edge of civil war, with fundamental questions about union, liberty, and human rights at stake. Lincoln's presidency, though new, was immediately consumed by crisis. Efforts at compromise failed, and the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War. The conflict would become the most devastating in American history, testing the nation's resilience, values, and commitment to its founding principles. Soldiers from both North and South faced unimaginable hardships, fighting in battles that would become legendary. Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, and countless others. The war's scale, technology, and brutality transformed American society, leaving scars that would take generations to heal. The Civil War was not only a military conflict, but also a moral struggle over slavery, freedom, and the meaning of citizenship. Emancipation became a central goal for the Union, culminating in the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which declared the freedom of all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory. African American soldiers joined the fight, contributing courage and determination that challenged prevailing prejudices. The war forced Americans to confront the contradictions between the nation's ideals and its practices, shaping the future trajectory of civil rights and citizenship. Even as the fighting raged, life on the home front evolved dramatically. Women in both North and South took on new roles, managing farms, businesses, and households, and serving as nurses and aid workers. Communities endured shortages, inflation, and loss, yet also displayed remarkable resilience. Newspapers chronicled the war in vivid detail, keeping citizens informed and emotionally invested. Technological innovations, including the use of railroads for troop movements and telegraphs for strategic communication, demonstrated how industry and invention were reshaping the conduct of war. The Civil War, which erupted in 1861, was a clash not just of armies but of visions for the nation. The Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln, sought to preserve the United States, while the Confederacy, under President Jefferson Davis, fought to defend slavery and states' rights. The war quickly escalated into a massive struggle that would last 4 brutal years, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and reshaping the country forever. Early battles exposed the Union's lack of preparation. At Bull Run in July 1861, Union forces suffered a shocking defeat, demonstrating that enthusiasm alone could not replace strategy, training, and experience. The Confederates, motivated by a fierce sense of independence and defending their homeland, often outmaneuvered Union forces in these initial engagements. Yet despite these setbacks, the North's industrial might, larger population, and extensive rail networks offered long-term advantages that would become increasingly decisive. The war soon expanded into multiple theaters, from Virginia and Maryland to Tennessee and Mississippi. Generals on both sides, like Ulysses S. Grant for the Union and Robert E. Lee for the Confederacy, emerged as central figures. Lee's brilliance in campaigns such as the 7 Days Battles and the Second Battle of Bull Run earned him respect, even among Northern adversaries. Grant's persistence in the Western theater, capturing key positions like Fort Donelson and Vicksburg, showcased the Union's growing capacity for coordinated, sustained military campaigns. Battles were no longer brief skirmishes. They involved tens of thousands of soldiers, complex logistics, and devastating casualties. The human cost of the war was staggering. Soldiers faced disease, exposure, and horrific battlefield injuries. Medical knowledge was limited, and hospitals struggled to care for the wounded. Both armies relied heavily on volunteers, many of them young men who endured months of camp life, drilling, and intermittent combat. Letters home reveal the emotional toll, filled with fear, hope, and longing for normalcy. Families in the North and South alike confronted the war's harsh realities: loss, separation, and the uncertainty of survival. A defining aspect of the Civil War was the question of slavery and freedom. While preserving the Union remained the initial focus for Lincoln, the issue of emancipation gained urgency as the war progressed. In 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and by January 1, 1863, the final proclamation declared enslaved people in Confederate-held territories free. This transformed the war's moral and strategic dimensions. African Americans joined the Union Army and Navy in significant numbers, bringing courage, skill, and determination to the fight while asserting their right to citizenship and self-determination. The proclamation also complicated international relations, discouraging European powers from supporting the Confederacy. Battles such as Antietam, Gettysburg, and Shiloh became defining moments. Antietam in September 1862, the bloodiest single day in American history, demonstrated both the horrors of modern warfare and the high stakes of the conflict. Gettysburg in July 1863 marked a turning point, with Lee's ambitious invasion of the North repelled, signaling that the Confederacy could no longer dictate the war's momentum. Grant's campaign in Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy and crippling its ability to move resources. Victory was measured not just in territorial gains, but in the ability to sustain armies and weaken the opponent's economic and psychological capacity. Life at home reflected the war's pervasive impact. Northern industries expanded to supply uniforms, weapons, and food, fueling economic growth, but also causing labor unrest and inflation. Southern civilians faced shortages of goods, destruction of farmland, and the constant threat of Union raids. Women played crucial roles on both sides, taking charge of homes and businesses, serving as nurses and organizing aid societies. The war challenged traditional gender roles, demonstrating women's capacity to sustain society under extreme pressure. The end of the Civil War in 1865 brought victory for the Union, but at tremendous cost. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending Confederate resistance. The nation faced the daunting task of Reconstruction, integrating formerly enslaved people into society, rebuilding the devastated South, and redefining the meaning of citizenship and civil rights. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but the struggle for equality and justice would continue for generations, highlighting the long shadow cast by this transformative conflict. The Reconstruction era began in 1865, as the nation faced the enormous task of reuniting after 4 years of civil war. Cities, farms, and infrastructure in the South lay in ruins. Millions of formerly enslaved people, newly free, sought to establish lives of independence and dignity. At the same time, the federal government wrestled with questions about how to reintegrate the Southern states and ensure rights for African Americans. This period would test the limits of American democracy, the meaning of citizenship, and the nation's ability to live up to its founding ideals. President Abraham Lincoln had begun envisioning a plan for post-war reconciliation before his assassination, emphasizing a moderate approach that aimed to bring Southern states back into the Union swiftly. After his death, President Andrew Johnson took up the challenge, offering pardons to many former Confederates and allowing states to establish governments with minimal federal oversight. However, Johnson's leniency alarmed radical Republicans in Congress, who believed that stronger protections for freed people and stricter conditions for Southern reintegration were necessary to prevent the old planter elite from regaining control. Congress took decisive action to shape Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery nationwide, legally freeing millions of African Americans. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to anyone born in the United States and promised equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited states from denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These constitutional changes were revolutionary, creating a new legal framework intended to secure freedom and political participation for African Americans. Despite these advances, Reconstruction faced fierce resistance. Southern states implemented black codes to restrict the freedom of African Americans, controlling where they could work, live, and travel. White supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, emerged to intimidate black citizens and suppress their political involvement through violence and terror. Federal troops were deployed to protect voting rights and maintain order, highlighting the ongoing struggle between federal authority and local resistance. The period became a tense balancing act between progress and reaction, hope and hostility. Reconstruction also brought significant political changes in the South. African Americans began participating in elections, holding office at local, state, and federal levels. Figures such as Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce became the first African American senators, while countless others served in state legislatures and local governments. These achievements symbolized a dramatic shift in political power and social dynamics, even if the gains were fragile and often contested. Freed people organized communities, established schools, and founded churches, creating institutions that would serve as the foundation for social and cultural life for generations. Economically, the South faced tremendous challenges. Plantations lay in disrepair, and the economy, once dependent on enslaved labor, had to adapt to new realities. Sharecropping and tenant farming became widespread, offering freed people a way to work the land in exchange for a portion of the crops. While these arrangements provided some autonomy, they often resulted in cycles of debt and poverty, leaving African Americans and poor whites trapped in difficult circumstances. Meanwhile, industrialization slowly began to take root, particularly in urban centers, although the South remained largely agricultural for decades. Education became a central focus during Reconstruction. Freed people recognized literacy and learning as key tools for empowerment. Northern missionary societies and the Freedmen's Bureau established schools across the South, teaching reading, writing, and vocational skills. The creation of institutions like Howard University and Fisk University provided higher education opportunities, fostering leadership and intellectual growth among African Americans. Education became a battleground for the future, reflecting the belief that knowledge was both liberation and protection against oppression. Nationally, Reconstruction fueled heated political battles. President Johnson's opposition to radical Reconstruction led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1868. He was acquitted in the Senate by a single vote, illustrating the intensity of the conflict between executive and legislative branches. Election campaigns were fiercely contested, with Northern voters increasingly divided over the cost and purpose of federal involvement in Southern affairs. By 1877, the disputed presidential election of 1876 resulted in the Compromise of 1877, effectively ending Reconstruction. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, leaving African Americans politically vulnerable and ushering in an era of Jim Crow laws and systemic disenfranchisement that would last nearly a century. Even as Reconstruction ended, the period left a profound legacy. Constitutional amendments reshaped the nation, laying the groundwork for future civil rights struggles. Freed people's institutions, communities, and resilience demonstrated the possibility of progress despite systemic obstacles. The era highlighted the complexities of rebuilding a nation fractured by civil war, the tension between idealism and political pragmatism, and the enduring challenge of achieving equality in a deeply divided society. The Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe a society glittering on the surface but marked by deep social inequalities, stretched roughly from the 1870s to the turn of the 20th century. Following Reconstruction, the nation experienced unprecedented economic expansion. Railroads, steel mills, and factories fueled industrialization, transforming the United States from a largely agrarian society into a global industrial power. Cities grew at dizzying rates as immigrants arrived in search of opportunity, and technological innovations reshaped daily life, work, and communication. Railroads were the lifeblood of the era, connecting the East and West and enabling commerce on an unprecedented scale. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 symbolized the nation's new reach, linking distant regions and making the transport of goods and people faster and cheaper. Railroads encouraged the growth of towns along their routes and spurred the mining and timber industries. However, railroad companies wielded enormous power, often engaging in monopolistic practices, price fixing, and corruption. This prompted public outcry and eventually led to the first federal attempts at regulation, including the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Industrial tycoons emerged as defining figures of the Gilded Age. Andrew Carnegie dominated the steel industry, building an empire that supplied the nation's infrastructure and urban skyline. John D. Rockefeller created the Standard Oil Company, consolidating control over oil production and refining, and becoming one of the wealthiest individuals in history. Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and other magnates amassed fortunes, earning admiration for their business acumen and criticism for their ruthless methods. While their wealth symbolized opportunity and innovation, it also highlighted growing inequality, sparking debates about labor rights, monopoly, and the moral responsibilities of the wealthy. Urbanization transformed American life. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia ballooned in population, fueled by immigration from Europe and migration from rural areas. Tenements and slums proliferated, often overcrowded and unsanitary, exposing residents to disease and poverty. Immigrants, including Irish, Italians, Germans, and Eastern Europeans, provided labor for factories, railroads, and construction projects. They brought diverse cultures, religions, and traditions, enriching the nation's social fabric while also facing discrimination, nativism, and harsh working conditions. Life in the city was a mix of opportunity and struggle, with children working in factories alongside adults and families striving to build stability in challenging circumstances. Labor movements emerged in response to harsh conditions, long hours, and low pay. Strikes, protests, and labor unions became increasingly common. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Riot of 1886, and the Homestead Strike of 1892 highlighted the growing tensions between workers and industrialists. Labor organizers demanded fair wages, safer working conditions, and recognition of unions. Women also played a crucial role in labor activism, advocating for both workers' rights and broader social reforms. These struggles laid the groundwork for the labor protections and reforms of the 20th century. Technological innovations transformed everyday life and industry. Electricity revolutionized factories, homes, and public spaces, while inventions like the telephone, typewriter, and light bulb reshaped communication and work. Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla became symbols of the era's inventive spirit, driving the nation toward a new age of modern convenience and productivity. Agriculture, too, benefited from technological advances, with mechanized tools and improved farming techniques increasing productivity and supporting population growth. The Gilded Age was also marked by political corruption and reform efforts. Political machines, most famously Tammany Hall in New York City, controlled elections, patronage, and municipal governance through networks of loyalty and influence. Bosses like William Boss Tweed wielded enormous power, often enriching themselves at public expense. Reform movements sought to address these abuses, leading to civil service reforms such as the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883, which aimed to reduce patronage and professionalize government service. Women's suffrage, temperance, and social welfare reform gained momentum, reflecting the era's push for social change amid rapid modernization. Education expanded significantly during the Gilded Age. Public schools, particularly in urban areas, grew in both number and quality, providing literacy and vocational skills to an increasing number of children. Higher education also developed, with institutions such as Johns Hopkins University pioneering research and graduate studies. African Americans in the South, despite facing segregation and disenfranchisement, built schools, colleges, and cultural institutions to educate their communities, continuing the legacy of Reconstruction's emphasis on education as a pathway to empowerment. Culturally, the Gilded Age was a time of contrasts. The wealthy enjoyed grand mansions, luxurious lifestyles, and patronage of the arts, while millions of Americans lived in poverty, struggling to survive. Literature, journalism, and art reflected these disparities. Realist and naturalist writers, including Henry James and Stephen Crane, depicted society with unflinching detail, while magazines and newspapers brought news and culture to a growing reading public. Amusement parks, theaters, and vaudeville shows provided entertainment, offering brief escapes from the challenges of urban and industrial life. Immigration and urban growth also fueled nativist backlash. Anti-immigrant sentiment manifested in restrictive laws and social prejudice, particularly against Catholics, Jews, and Southern and Eastern Europeans. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 marked the first major federal restriction on immigration, reflecting racial and cultural anxieties. These tensions highlighted the challenges of integrating a diverse population while maintaining social cohesion and political stability. By the close of the 19th century, the United States had transformed dramatically. Industrial power, urban expansion, technological innovation, and social change had created a modern nation, poised for international influence. Yet, inequality, labor unrest, racial discrimination, and political corruption reminded Americans that progress was uneven and that the ideals of liberty and equality remained a work in progress. The Gilded Age laid the foundations for the progressive era that would follow, when reformers would confront these challenges more directly, seeking to make the nation's prosperity more equitable and its democracy more accountable. The progressive era arose as a response to the excesses and inequalities of the Gilded Age. Rapid industrialization, urban growth, and political corruption had created both opportunity and unrest. Reformers, known as progressives, sought to curb the power of monopolies, improve working conditions, expand democracy, and promote social justice. They came from many walks of life: middle-class professionals, journalists, educators, religious leaders, and even some politicians who believed that government could be a tool for positive change rather than a vehicle for entrenched power. One of the most visible aspects of progressive reform was the fight against political corruption. Political machines, which had dominated city governments, were challenged through electoral reforms such as the introduction of secret ballots, direct election of senators, established by the 17th Amendment in 1913, and initiatives like the referendum and recall. Reformers pushed for professionalization in government through civil service reforms, reducing the influence of patronage, and ensuring that public offices were filled by qualified individuals. Muckraking journalists, such as Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, and Upton Sinclair, exposed corporate monopolies, urban corruption, and the harsh realities of industrial labor, sparking public outrage and legislative action. Economic reform was another central focus. Progressive leaders sought to regulate industries that wielded excessive power, particularly railroads, banks, and monopolies. Antitrust legislation, including the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, targeted corporate practices that stifled competition and exploited workers or consumers. Presidents like Theodore Roosevelt championed the Square Deal, emphasizing fairness in labor relations, consumer protection, and the breaking up of trusts. The federal government began to take a more active role in managing the economy and ensuring that capitalism served the broader public rather than a select few. Labor reform gained momentum during this era as well. Progressive activists advocated for shorter working hours, safer conditions, child labor restrictions, and the right to organize. Strikes and labor unrest continued, but legislative efforts increasingly sought to protect workers' rights. Women reformers, including Florence Kelley and Jane Addams, played leading roles in campaigns for labor laws, settlement houses, and social services. The Hull House in Chicago, founded by Addams, became a model for urban social work, offering education, childcare, and cultural programs to immigrant communities. Progressives believed that social reform could lift people out of poverty, integrate immigrants, and create a more just society. Women's rights emerged as a defining feature of the progressive era. The movement for women's suffrage gained momentum, building on decades of advocacy from figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Carrie Chapman Catt. Organizations such as the National American Woman Suffrage Association worked tirelessly to secure voting rights, combining grassroots activism with political lobbying. Their efforts culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women the right to vote nationwide. This achievement reshaped American politics, expanding the electorate and empowering women to influence public life directly. Racial inequality remained a persistent challenge. Despite the legal advances of Reconstruction, African Americans faced segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence under Jim Crow laws, particularly in the South. Progressive reformers often focused on urban and economic issues while neglecting racial justice, revealing the limits of the movement. Nonetheless, African American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Booker T. Washington advanced strategies for education, civil rights, and resistance, laying the foundation for future struggles. Du Bois co-founded the NAACP in 1909, advocating for political equality and challenging systemic oppression, while Wells exposed the horrors of lynching and called for national attention to racial violence. Education and public health reforms were key components of the progressive vision. Compulsory education laws spread across the nation, increasing literacy rates and preparing children for industrial society. Progressive educators emphasized practical skills, civic responsibility, and moral development. Public health campaigns targeted sanitation, clean water, and disease prevention, particularly in rapidly growing urban areas. Settlement houses, charitable organizations, and local governments collaborated to provide essential services to immigrant and working-class communities, improving standards of living and public awareness. The progressive era also witnessed significant cultural and social changes. Cities became centers of entertainment, literature, and art, reflecting a vibrant and diverse urban society. Sports, music, and theater gained popularity, while newspapers and magazines expanded public access to news and culture. Technological innovations, including the widespread use of electricity, automobiles, and telephones, transformed daily life. Americans were increasingly connected, informed, and mobile, experiencing both the excitement and the challenges of modernization. At the national level, the United States began to assert itself on the international stage. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency exemplified a more active foreign policy, with initiatives like the construction of the Panama Canal, the negotiation of the Treaty of Portsmouth ending the Russo-Japanese War, and the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine asserting American influence in Latin America. The progressive era set the stage for the United States' emergence as a global power, combining domestic reform with international ambition. By the 1920s, the progressive era had left a profound impact on American society. Reforms had expanded democracy, strengthened government oversight, improved working conditions, and increased social services. Women's suffrage and public health initiatives reshaped daily life. Yet the period also revealed ongoing challenges. Racial injustice persisted, economic inequalities remained, and debates over the proper role of government continued. The legacy of progressivism was a nation more aware of its responsibilities, more willing to experiment with reform, and more capable of addressing the complex challenges of modern industrial society. The 20th century dawned. The United States faced profound opportunities and challenges. Domestically, industrialization, urbanization, and technological innovation continued to transform everyday life. Automobiles, telephones, and electricity reshaped how Americans lived, worked, and connected. Cities swelled with immigrants seeking opportunity, contributing to a diverse and dynamic culture. Yet economic inequality, labor unrest, and racial discrimination persisted, highlighting the nation's ongoing struggles to live up to its ideals of liberty and equality. Internationally, the world was increasingly interconnected, and events abroad would soon draw the United States into global affairs. Though many Americans initially favored isolationism, The outbreak of World War I in Europe in 1914 posed moral, political, and economic questions that the nation could not ignore. Initially, the U.S. sought neutrality, trading with both Allied and Central powers, but German unrestricted submarine warfare and attacks on American vessels, combined with the Zimmermann telegram proposing a German-Mexican alliance, shifted public opinion. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, framing the conflict as a fight to make the world safe for democracy. American involvement in World War I was decisive both abroad and at home. Millions of U.S. soldiers, known as the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, under General John J. Pershing, were deployed to Europe, providing much-needed manpower and morale to weary Allied forces. The war effort also mobilized the domestic economy, leading to government oversight of industries, rationing, and large-scale propaganda campaigns encouraging support for the war. Women and African Americans entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling jobs vacated by men who went overseas, accelerating social change, and laying the foundation for future movements. The war's end in 1918 brought both relief and new challenges. The Treaty of Versailles formally ended hostilities, imposing harsh penalties on Germany, and the League of Nations was established to promote global peace. Domestically, however, the United States experienced labor unrest, racial tensions, and social upheaval. Returning soldiers faced unemployment, strikes erupted across industries, and the Red Summer of 1919 saw deadly racial violence in multiple cities, highlighting deep divisions that remained unresolved despite the country's democratic ideals. The 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, marked a period of cultural exuberance, economic expansion, and social transformation. Urban life flourished, fueled by technological innovations like the automobile, radio, and motion pictures. Cities became hubs of nightlife, jazz, and consumer culture, while rural areas often experienced slower change, creating cultural tensions between tradition and modernity. Women gained new freedoms, symbolized by the flapper image, young women embracing fashion, work, and social independence. The ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 ensured women's right to vote, reshaping politics and expanding participation in public life. Prohibition, established through the 18th Amendment in 1920, banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. While intended to reduce social problems, it instead fueled organized crime, speakeasies, and widespread defiance. Figures like Al Capone became notorious symbols of the era's contradictions, a society seeking morality while embracing excess. Despite these tensions, the economy boomed, driven by mass production, consumer credit, and technological innovation. Stock markets soared, radios and automobiles became household staples, and the idea of the American dream seemed more attainable than ever. Yet beneath the surface, economic fragility grew. Overproduction, uneven wealth distribution, and speculative investments created a volatile financial environment. On October 29, 1929 Black Tuesday the stock market collapsed, marking the beginning of the Great Depression the most severe economic crisis in U.S. history. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared to unprecedented levels. Millions of Americans faced poverty, hunger, and homelessness. Families were forced to adapt, often relying on community, charity, and government relief programs. The crisis exposed the weaknesses of unregulated capitalism and the need for new policies to protect citizens and stabilize the economy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected in 1932, responded with an ambitious program of reforms in public works known as the New Deal. Initiatives such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, Works Progress Administration, WPA, and Social Security Act provided jobs, infrastructure, and social safety nets. Banking reforms, labor protections, and regulatory agencies aim to restore confidence and ensure long-term economic stability. The New Deal reshaped the relationship between government and citizens, establishing the expectation that the federal government had a responsibility to intervene during crises and protect the welfare of the people. As the 1930s progressed, the world grew increasingly unstable. Dictatorships rose in Europe and Asia, with Adolf Hitler consolidating power in Germany, Benito Mussolini in Italy, and militarists in Japan pursuing aggressive expansion. While the United States initially maintained a policy of neutrality, the global situation could not be ignored. By the late 1930s, the nation began preparing for potential conflict, strengthening military capabilities, and providing aid to allied nations through programs like Lend-Lease. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, propelled the United States into World War II. Overnight, isolationism ended as the nation mobilized for a global struggle against fascism. Industrial production surged, creating jobs and transforming the economy. Millions of men enlisted or were drafted into the armed forces, while women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter. African Americans and other minority groups pushed for inclusion in defense industries and the military, laying the groundwork for the post-war civil rights movement. World War II also reshaped American society and global standing. The U.S. played a central role in both the European and Pacific theaters, from D-Day in Normandy to battles in the Pacific Islands. Scientific innovation, including the Manhattan Project, advanced technology and weaponry dramatically. By 1945, the United States emerged as a dominant military and economic power, wielding influence on a scale unparalleled in its history. The war's end marked the beginning of a new era, setting the stage for global leadership, the Cold War, and profound social change at home. After the end of World War II in 1945, the United States faced the enormous task of transitioning from a wartime economy to peacetime prosperity. Soldiers returned home, families reunited, and industries shifted from producing tanks and planes to cars, appliances, and consumer goods. The post-war era brought unprecedented economic growth, fueled by pent-up demand, technological innovation, and government programs like the GI Bill, which provided education, housing loans, and job training for returning veterans. Millions of Americans moved to suburbs, creating new communities and reshaping the nation's physical and cultural landscape. The rise of suburbs, exemplified by developments like Levittown in New York, reflected broader social changes. Affordable housing, mass-produced homes, and expanding highways made suburban life accessible to many families, creating a new ideal of the American dream. However, these developments also revealed social inequalities. Discriminatory practices such as redlining and restrictive covenants limited access to homeownership for African Americans and other minorities, reinforcing patterns of racial segregation. Suburban growth reshaped politics, education, and social norms, emphasizing family life, consumer culture, and mobility. Economically, the post-war boom fueled optimism. Manufacturing expanded, wages increased, and standards of living rose dramatically. Automobiles became central to American life, influencing commuting, leisure, and commerce. Television emerged as a powerful medium, shaping public opinion, popular culture, and advertising. These changes created a sense of abundance and national confidence, with many Americans believing in limitless opportunity and progress. Yet the post-war period was also marked by geopolitical tension. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as global superpowers with conflicting ideologies: capitalism and democracy versus communism and authoritarianism. The Cold War began, shaping foreign policy, military strategy, and domestic life. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 committed the U.S. to containing communism, while the Marshall Plan provided economic aid to rebuild Western Europe, strengthening alliances and promoting stability. The formation of NATO in 1949 formalized a military alliance against Soviet expansion, signaling America's new global leadership role. Domestically, the early Cold War fostered both fear and vigilance. Anti-communist sentiment grew, fueled by events such as the Soviet Union's development of nuclear weapons, the rise of China as a communist power in 1949, and revelations of espionage. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, and figures like Senator Joseph McCarthy spearheaded investigations into alleged communist influence, creating a climate of suspicion and political tension. Loyalty oaths, blacklists, and trials reflected the anxieties of a nation navigating ideological conflict while trying to preserve civil liberties. Social change also accelerated in post-war America. The civil rights movement began to gain momentum, challenging racial segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. Landmark events, such as the *1948 desegregation of the Armed Forces by President Harry Truman, and the legal victories of the NAACP in cases like *Sweat v. Painter, 1950, signaled growing federal support for civil rights. African American activism in cities and communities across the country laid the foundation for the mass movements of the 1950s and 1960s. Education and science flourished as well. The post-war era saw increased investment in public education, higher education, and scientific research, driven in part by Cold War competition. The launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik in 1957 spurred the United States to invest heavily in science, technology, and math education, leading to innovations in aerospace, computing, and engineering. These efforts shaped the workforce of the future and reinforced America's position as a technological and industrial leader. Culturally, the 1950s blended tradition and change. Rock and roll, exemplified by figures like Elvis Presley, challenged social norms and captivated youth culture. Television shows, movies, and magazines promoted idealized images of family, work, and leisure, reflecting both conformity and the promise of upward mobility. At the same time, undercurrents of dissent, creativity, and social critique began to emerge, signaling the cultural revolutions that would intensify in the 1960s. By the end of the 1950s, America had become a confident, prosperous, and influential nation. Its economy was strong, its suburbs were growing, and its global influence was unmatched. Yet challenges remained. Racial inequality, ideological conflict, and social tensions foreshadowed the upheavals and transformations of the coming decades. The stage was set for the 1960s, when civil rights, the Cold War, and cultural change would push the nation to confront its values and redefine its identity.